Today's program, we are real fortunate. Never been done before, and I think it's something that really fits into the history of Bighorn and the Little Goose Valley. Vic Garber and his buddy Ed Schunk are going to tell us about water storage, diversions, transmission, irrigation ditches, irrigation companies, everything that there is to know about water in Little Goose and maybe even some of the Piney Creek Valley water storage that ended up here making this the lush valley that it is. So without further, where's Vic?
He's right across from me.
Oh, there he is. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Vic, who will take the program from here.
Does that include rainmaking?
I'm not a good rain dancer, no I'm not. I'll leave that up to Edward. Edward, what are you? Edward's going to start this program defining some of the terms of water, and then he's going to conclude the program talking about reservoirs. Judy Slack will show pictures that the Bowman family has given to the Historical Society, and she's got them ready to project, and she's made copies of those pictures that she will pass around at the conclusion of my comments. Edward, go ahead.
Well, Vic, I'm blessed to have you ask me to help you out on this, so appreciate that honor. He did ask me to define some of the words that he'll talk about and some of the words that go with water and water law. Some of the different appropriations and appropriators. He will discuss the appropriators. He knows more history about those people than I do. And so I'm going to start off with some of the terms that we're going to use. You have to remember we have several different uses of water as they're filed. When you make that application, you file them as a different use. And the most popular one in those days, what we're talking about, was irrigation. However, there were some sightseers a lot farther down the road that filed them for domestic as well as irrigation. Some of those domestic uses were filed in 1879, so if you hear me say anything about the dates, I'm going to use the last two numbers, it'll be 79, 85, 83. It's not 1900, it's 1800. So some of the original rights go back to 79. Some of those original rights were changed to preferred uses. The 79 rights. Those preferred uses were from irrigation to domestic use for the household. So it's nothing new. There's going to be a lot more of that going on in the future, but it already has been done. In those days, we didn't have any drilling, so to speak, until Park Reservoir and stuff were built. Those were filed for many more uses, but that was in the 1900s. So we're just going to work on the 1800s. The three most uses were in those days irrigation, stock, and domestic. Most of them were irrigation. Now, you have to remember some of these appropriators back in the 1800s are names of the property owners who had those properties. For instance, our place is surrounded on both sides, on two sides, by Carlisle County Ditch. We're a Peralta ditch user, an entirely different source of water from a different drainage. It's diverted to Little Goose. It just depends on the owners who got involved with the ditches at the time that they filled out those applications. Many people filed individually, and many filed together as individuals with the same date and the same use. So you may have an appropriation with many names, the same date, same use, but all the names, appropriator names, are listed. They usually also are listed with that is the source where the water comes from and the date. Everything before 1900 was territorial. So that's the way they were named. Later on, the dates came in later, but they are filed as territorial permits. Most of them have the dates on them. the exact dates. Sometimes there's the month and the year's there, and the day itself is not in there. Some of the descriptions that were filed on the original appropriators have been changed over the last 100+ years, and they've been amended, or they've been corrected, or they've been transferred to a different land description. Not many, but there were. Yes, there were mistakes in the land descriptions originally, but we still have those mistakes on our books in some cases. As far as measurement of water, irrigation ditches, ditch riders measure water by cubic feet per second. 1 cubic foot. Well, that's bigger than a foot. 1 cubic foot. That's equivalent to 62.4 pounds, and it's 7.48 gallons. That cubic foot goes through a measuring device called a parshell, or any other type. There are other types. Most common is the parshell. 1 cubic foot per second. So you know that that 1 cubic foot goes through there every second. Most parshells, the ones with the curved bottoms on the tail part, are very easy to calculate, and they're very easy to estimate. There are formulas for them. Usually when the measuring stick is 1 foot high, for every height it is 1 foot, and it's 1 foot wide, it's 4 cubic feet. It's 2 foot wide, 1 foot high, that's 8 cubic feet. So it's in increments of 4. Makes it very easy. What you don't know is the ones in between. Those are the ones you usually have to look up. Water is owned by the state, not by us as appropriate. The state owns the water in this state. Priority of the appropriation is based on the seniority, the date that it was applied for, and to have it adjudicated means it's completed. The unit, the irrigation, whether it's reservoir or ditch, has been proofed. The proof is there that it has been used on that property through that ditch, through that source, through that head gate. The senior water rights in the last few years have even been jeopardized by the drought. We have water rights on Little Goose Creek clear back to '79 on the tributaries to Little Goose. There's nothing on Little Goose itself. It has a '79 water right. The earliest water right we have on Little Goose, of course, is Girdle Ditch. That's number 1. And those rights have priority over everybody else's rights on it, including the tributaries that come in. When I first moved down here in the '60s, the diversion ditches like Colorado Colony did not have to have a source of water diverted or bypassed that head gate, because there was enough return flow to satisfy the higher priorities downstream from the head gate of Colorado Colony. That head gate's up there in Wallach's Field as you go up Little Goose Canyon. You cross it going up to the O.S. Watt Smith's place, which is now the Meredith place. Nowadays, they're bypassing a lot of water with that 83 priority of Colorado Colony. There are several reasons why that happens. One is we've got a severe drought. We haven't had those severe droughts like that for many, many years. I'm sure Vic can give you some dates, and these old timers can give dates of severe drought. The amount of water that's bypassed anymore is just unbelievable. That original filing for Colorado Colony was 93 cubic feet. That's a lot of water. It's the biggest canal in Little Goose. Now, when that gets cut down, of course that's going to taper off as June comes by, but lately we're out of that priority date in early June, sometimes in May. So drought has a lot to do with it. The other thing has a lot to do with it is water is regulated by convenience more than it is by priority date. It's easier to go just a big head gate than it is to go up and down the draws and throw everybody's pumps out of the draws. This is one of the biggest setbacks that we have, is that people believe now that they own the water when they build a house on that piece of land. That's their water. A pump goes in there, and they're never, very seldom ever questioned on that. And we're losing a lot of water due to that. And therefore, it becomes a problem. They do not have riparian rights like they do in some states. The main main thing that, I think that's the main thing that Vic wanted me to talk about, and I was told to keep it brief, so. If you have any questions, you can ask Vic, he can answer all the questions. Vic has, I've learned a lot from Vic over the years with water. I've learned a lot from Alan Fordyce with water. He and I used to get together and talk water a lot of times. He had a lot of big ideas, so did Vic. And someday those ideas are gonna come into being before you know it. Then you'll know about what they are. There were, as this man here said, the drainages from over that come off the mountains on the other side of Story. There are ditches that bring this water right over here above Bighorn. Mr. Fordyce's one of his original ideas was to put it back into Little Goose, above all the head gates. He had that entire system figured out. The physical part was there all but through one property owner. Couldn't get permission, or that would have been done. And there's still a possibility that can be done. It'd probably be tubed this time instead of through an open ditch. So I'll leave it at that, turn it over to Vic. He's very knowledgeable about this, and he's got a much more interesting one.
I want to make one slightly different statement. He said that the territorial water rights were in effect until 1900. Territorial water rights were those water rights that were appropriated prior to statehood. After statehood, then they became state water rights, and the dates so reflect. But a territorial water right was a water right that was perfected prior to statehood. The first water rights that we're going to talk about is not mentioned in the water book, but they were actually appropriated when Wyoming was still part of Dakota territory, but only a very few of them. I'm going to start this off. Excuse me, I have to read these notes, and I'm a little slow on it because of my bad eyesight. To perfect a water right, you had to file on it, and then you had to dig the ditch and put the water to beneficial use. And to do this in the 1800s, these are the tools that you surveyed. You had a simple level on a tripod, or what you might call a transit on a tripod, and a rod. Or the most common way that it was done, especially on the small creeks, like Hannah Creek, Jackson Creek, and so on, I'll get to them later, was with a board approximately 16 feet long. That one leg, if it was 16 feet long, the common rule of thumb was that one leg was a quarter of an inch shorter than the other leg, and you secured a standard carpenter's level to the top of the board, and you set this board down with the carpenter's level, dead level, and that gave you a quarter of an inch of fall to 16 feet. There were several names for that. The common names were a Mormon board, a cricket, or a grasshopper. There were also eye levels, just a simple level with an eyepiece that you held up, and somebody else held a rod with notches on it or numbers, and hopefully the man that was using the eye level was as steady as a tripod, you got a decent survey. But usually if you used that kind of a method, you gave it a good deal more fall than a quarter of an inch to 16 feet. And in this valley, the slope to the north is so steep that you could make very fast ditches, and of course the faster the ditch ran, the less the ditch loss was. A slow ditch loses more water than a more rapidly flowing ditch. The tools we used to dig these ditches were pick and shovel, axes and saws, and then a road plow or a common plow if it wasn't just rocky, and a homemade device that people called a go-devil. In later years in this community, it was called a Martin Ditcher, because Lem Martin used these, and various blacksmiths improved upon them. waterside, as you pulled it with a team of horses or whatever number of horses it took, slid the dirt up on an incline to make your lower bank. Then there were slips, Fresnos, and if it was a larger ditch, then you used a wheel scraper, which was well balanced on two wheels on a drop axle. One man could operate it with any number of horses depending upon the width of the ditch they were working in. And when you lifted up on the handle it dug, when you pushed down on the handle it carried, when you wanted to unload it you lifted it up and hoped you got out of the road before it dripped. They were very crude, but they were very efficient, and that's how all the early larger ditches were built. Also, contractor had to have a star drill, hammer, and a metal spoon to take the rock chippings out of the hole if there were large rocks or rock ledge, like in the canyon, to be gone through to take the rock filings out so they could pack the hole with black powder for blasting. Blacksmiths made numerous kinds of chains and combinations of chains to wrap around these large boulders that were very prevalent in the ends of the glacier moraines, alpine glacier moraines that constitute the soil buildup of this entire valley, and it's awfully hard to put a choker chain on a round rock. So blacksmiths made chains that ultimately were a basket that met with two rings, and you just put a choker chain between the two rings. You could take a team of horses or 4 horses, whatever the size of the boulder, and drag it out of the ditch. And up until just a few years ago, I knew where there were a dozen, at least, of these huge boulders that were taken out of the Colorado ditch, and the landowners farmed around them because they didn't have any way to hitch onto the round things to get them out of the road until bulldozers or other equipment came into usage. The first water rights, as Edward said, were out of the small streams. It was much easier for a pioneer to build a small ditch out of a tributary to Little Goose than it was to build a ditch out of Little Goose, because of the expense of building a head gate, and usually it would have to be 2 or 3 people joined together in a ditch company. But you could take a ditch out of a small stream such as Hannah Creek, Kemp Creek, Jackson Creek, or Sackett Creek, and do it all himself with a plow and a homemade go devil, and he didn't have to have a diversion structure. He didn't have to have a division box. Edward spoke of measuring water with weirs. In my formative years, all the ditches, such as the Peralta and the east side and the girdle ditch, didn't have weirs. They had division boxes. And if a man had a 1.5 foot of water out of a ditch with 10 feet of water in it, why, his dividing board just sat over just so far in the ditch, and the water went out into his lateral. And those were division boxes, and they had to be, there was no means to pour cement readily. It was a difficult job to make cement in a wheelbarrow or some other way, so they were always made out of wood. And division boxes went out completely out of the ditches in this community in the 1940s and 1950s, when everybody started using wheeled head gates and weirs, as Edward explained. Okay, the first water right out of the Little Goose Watershed was O.P. Hanna's in '79. Now I'm going to try and give a little discussion on each of the original appropriators. And I want you to bear in mind something that Edward said. In the 1963 water book that Edward and I worked out of, some of the original appropriators have been dropped, and the owners of the land appropriation was made to are in the water book, but we know that those names that were in the water book in 1963 were not the original appropriators, and I had no way of finding them. And in one or two cases, I'm going to speak of those people who were not original appropriators, but did own the land that the original appropriation was on, because they were a vital part to the development of this community. And I'll try to refer to those as I go along. If not, well, bear with me that I've overlooked them. Oliver Perry Hanna, when he was 17 years of age, left Illinois, went to Fort Scott, Kansas, then to Deer Lodge, Montana, and I don't know how he got to Deer Lodge, whether he went up by riverboat and across, or whether he went cross-country. But while he was in the Deer Lodge area in Montana, he stayed in that vicinities of Montana for about 10 years, doing numerous things. He worked with a freight outfit that actually hauled freight as far east and south as Red Cloud Agency. But I think the thing that he was probably proudest of was that he was part of the Hayden survey crew that surveyed Yellowstone Park. After 10 years, he went back east, back to Illinois, and he was on his way with a pack horse and his own horse going to Virginia City, Montana, when he came by Fort Kinney in Buffalo area and took the contract to supply wild meat to the post over there. And he filed his claim here just south of Bighorn in 78, and he filed for the water right out of Hannah Creek, which he named after himself, in 79. He went ahead and plowed, raised a crop of oats there, harvested the oats, threshed it by hand, and sold it for 10 cents a pound. He was the original lot owner here in the town site of Bighorn later on, and he built the Occidental Hotel, which is part of Bighorn's history, that stood right across the street from the Bighorn Burke. He was postmaster in Sheridan for 4 years, and he sold the Wallop in 1885. Now I'll talk about some of the creeks, because, as Edward said, the creek filings were all territorial filings, and they came on more rapidly than the larger filings out of Little Goose, because of the reasons that I just stated. I said why it was easier to file out of the little creeks, and the creeks that were important to the agricultural development of the community primarily were Hannah Creek, Jackson Creek, Herbal Creek, and Kemp Creek. All of those creeks are upstream from the town site of Bighorn. On Hannah Creek, well, I'll get to that later on. Jackson Creek, there were 5 territorial appropriators. Jackson, who I'll get to later on as a appropriator in another ditch, I'll give some on him. And then I'll go to the Lambergers, who had the Cold Springs Seed Farm up Jackson Creek on the land that Benson and Olson, some of you people might remember the Benson and Olson families. They were the next appropriators, but prior to that, there was a filing that irrigated land just north of Bighorn, and all I know about that is that it was called the Negro John Ditch, and it's so listed still in the water book that way today. And I can't give you the approximate location, but it's just north of Bighorn. Wagner family wound up as pioneers owning the land, but that first got a legalage on water right. Good. Then also on Hannah Creek, there was an O.T. Hill who filed on Hannah Creek clear back in 79 or 80. And I'm sure that O.T. Hill was not his given name because he was a immigrant that had taken out American citizenship, but he had been a Prussian soldier. So O.T. Hill must have been a name that he took for himself, because I'm sure that coming out of Eastern Europe, that Hill was probably not his name. He is homestead dwelling with a hole in the ground. It's in the Polo Ranch, and not over 6 weeks ago, son David and I were moving cattle on the Polo Ranch, and he and I both stopped on he on his horse and me on my four-wheeler, and looked at the hole where O.T. Hill's cabin was. That ditch out of Hannah Creek started down below my house where I live, and it's never been in use that way, but it was diverted into the Peralta ditch and was changed to diversion, but it's still a very valid water right. It's probably the largest single water right out of Hannah Creek.
Probably over the hill.
Then there was R.T. Hayes, who had a territorial right, and he homesteaded part of the land of the ranch that Garber Agribusiness owns. It's my home now. And Hayes went ahead, sold that ranch, and then bought land over by the Bighorn Cemetery, and he was a community blacksmith for a good many years. And on Hurlbut Creek, Hurlbuts were the first territorial appropriators out of it. That's the creek that's up in the Hidden Valley Ranch. It's the creek that originates right down behind Rocky Point. Any direction from Rocky Point straight down is Hurlbut Creek, and that's in the Hidden Valley Ranch now. And the Hurlbut family were the first dairy farmers in this community. And then the Stewarts had a water right out of Hurlbut Creek that was even upstream from the Hurlbuts. And the Stewart father and son were the people who carried the mail for the 2 years that from the time that the Burlington Railroad was built into Sheridan and going on around the mountain and back down to the Gray Bull and Basin area. They carried the mail. I don't know who had the contract, but those two men carried the mail on a weekly basis in the wintertime, on a bi-weekly basis in the summertime, using a wagon in the summertime. In the fall and spring, they used pack horses. In the dead of winter, they snowshoed, put the first-class mail on pack dogs. And we think we have it tough. Now, I'll go into some of the other side creeks as we go along. The Girdle Ditch is the first ditch out of the main stream of Little Goose, and it was filed on in 81, and it is the land that's now where the cluster houses are on the Powderhorn as you drive toward Sheridan. It's on the right-hand side where all those cluster houses are, and that's where the Girdle homestead and Girdle put together land there, and that's what we're talking about. Mr. and Mrs. Girdle were married in Germany in 1870, and they immediately immigrated to the United States and became citizens, and for about 10 years they were in Nebraska and other places, and then they came to Buffalo, Wyoming, and ultimately on over to this valley in 1879, and they arrived here from Buffalo in a used Army ambulance. And there's nothing new about people using surplus Army equipment. We all did. And I done agribusiness still got several surplus Mr. Girdle was a cobbler, and he was a maker of fine ladies' shoes. And in all the 10 years from the time they left Germany till they got here in '79, he still had some of those fine ladies' shoes. And there wasn't much of a market for them in Pioneer, Wyoming. And he lost the last of those in a fire in a shed he built down here right where the powder was. And I doubt if he had insurance. The Girdles were the parents of the first non-Indian child born in Sheridan County. And she married, lived in Sheridan most of her adult life. All about her is the Bighorn Pioneers and other things, so I won't go into it. Their son, oh, there was one other interesting thing about Mr. Girdle. He not only was a cobbler, but he was a pretty darn good blacksmith. And he made a plow out of scrap iron that he got some of it, things I read, from over at Fort McKinney at Buffalo, and he made a plow. And he was very generous and loaned that plow to several neighbors. His son, Herman, became a blacksmith, and he was a horseshoer for Torrey's Company E that was the Spanish-American War. Then there was a Charles Neal, who was an appropriator and I don't know much about him, except that he sold out to Thomas Culbertson in 1894, and he's buried in the Bighorn Cemetery, and the land that he homesteaded and appropriated the water from the Girdle Ditch is the land where the Circle Sprinkler is on the left side of the road as you go from the junction towards Little Goose or Woodland Park Village, where that sprinkler appeared a number of years ago. That's the land we're talking about. Then there was Martin McKee. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Martin McKee sold the land where the sprinklers are now to the Lewis brothers. And we'll hear more about the Lewis brothers a little bit later on. And he sold out in '95. And Howard B. Paxton sold to T.R. Robinson, and that's all I know about him. Then B.F. Martin was a Civil War veteran and a widower, and he sold to Jim Stratton in 1901, and I don't know any more about him. Then there was a J.F. Culver, who sold to John Wyman in 1903, and all I know is that he lived the rest of his life in Sheridan. Then we get to the East Side Ditch, which is still an '81 appropriation, and Edwin Field was the first appropriator, and he sold out in 1900. He was a signalman, and he died in 1906 and was buried in Bighorn. The records, most of these records are from Beck Hunter's book, and she very carefully chronicled the last census that they were enumerated in and where they were buried. Then there was J.M. Colrider, who sold out in 1900, and he took money from that and opened a cigar and candy store in Sheridan and operated it successfully for a good many years and retired in California. And John McCormick, he was a single person, and he sold to Joseph Royal in 1908, and he served one term in the Wyoming House and 2 terms in the Wyoming Senate. And then there was C.A. show that his body was shipped back and he was buried in Bighorn. And that's something that strikes me in many of these people, these original appropriators, went away, California or Seattle or somewhere, and lived out their older ages, but their remains were brought back here and they're part of the cemetery over here. And then we go to we're still on the east side ditch. James Benjamin Harbison. He came here in, I don't know the date he came here, but he sold his land. He had homesteaded on Lower Cruise Creek. Now the Harbisons were also appropriators on the east side ditch. They're appropriators up here on the Last Chance ditch. And the last Harbison home is right over here, 1 block south. It's where the Morelands live right now. That was the last Harbison home. That was the son of his son Perry. And Benjamin Harbison sold out to his son John Perry in 1899. And then his son Perry is the one who becomes an appropriator on the Last Chance ditch. Then there's C.H. Skinner, who came here in 1880. He was a freighter before coming here. He was a freighter in Dakota and Colorado. And in 1880, he formed a partnership with John Henry Sackett in Cheyenne, and they were staked to wholesale goods and started freighting from Cheyenne and Rockford Station north to, and ultimately Bighorn and other points, Buffalo and so on. And in 1880, they built the Bighorn Mercantile and the warehouse over here, and he became, and built, and started the post office. And I'll get to the Sacketts later on another appropriator. Then there was Levi Wood, who patented the land over on McCormick Creek, where Fran Fletcher now lives. And he was his wife died just soon after he was here, and he raised a family of children over there with the help of a housekeeper. And we'll hear more about the Woods later, because his son then became an appropriator on land just south of Bighorn here. And then we get to John Henry Sackett. Now, John Henry Sackett homesteaded the land that's just straight east of here on the other side of Big Goose, on the other side of Little Goose. And it's the land where why does your mind do this? Well, lives on part of that land over there. And he and Skinner were very instrumental in the development of many things in the community. Henry Sackett was postmaster in the store here in Bighorn, or the building that was the postman, from 1881 to 1885. The only 2 county fairs ever held in Bighorn City were on his land. And the county fairs were just about in the area where Willa Loomis now lives, just a little bit north of there. And when I was a lad, you could still see the remnants of a circle of the racetrack that was over there. In 1886, he sold his half of the mercantile to Skinner. Two of the Sackett children, one of them married Gatchell, who became a druggist in Buffalo, and the program last month was about the Gatchell Museum. And all the Sacketts have been very instrumental in preserving early Wyoming history. Descendants of both Sackett families have patented land on Little Fork of Powder River, and their descendants have been very active in establishing that museum at KC and helping with other things in the Buffalo area, and even have come back and helped some here. Son Carl Sackett and the lady who became Mrs. Getchell were both graduates of the Wyoming Institute, which was the college that was here in Bighorn, and after it went broke, it became the two-story schoolhouse that was here in Bighorn for many, many years, and that was the school that I attended until in the 1930s. Now, we get to the Burn Clue Ditch, which goes out on the other side goes out on the east side of Little Goose, and I can't find why the Burn Clue Ditch was called the Burn Clue. Does anybody in the audience know? Well, no wonder it couldn't. There were 8 territorially appropriated, and I'll take them as they come to them. There was Henry Asa Coffeen. Almost everybody in the room, I'm sure, knows a lot about the history of the Coffeen family. In 1884, Mr. Coffeen had a store here in Bighorn City, and in 1887, he dismantled the store and moved it to Sheridan, and he was a Sheridan businessman all his life. He did many things, probably best known today for his collection of pictures and artifacts, which have been a big help to the Sheridan Historical Society and to this society and to a lot of people doing research. He was a forward-looking man. He served on the Wyoming Constitutional Convention prior to statehood. He was a representative to Congress by appointment before statehood, and he was a trustee of the University of Wyoming later on. And then there was George Brundage, and he and his brother Thomas Brundage had traveled across this area, across Little Goose Valley here, in 1864. That was 2 years before the forts were built along the Bozeman Trail. And I think it's important to read about the size of that contingency. And I quote this from Elsa Spear Byron's scrapbook of the Bozeman Trail. This is Tom Brundage's diary, and it was his brother George who we're talking about. Tom Brundage later on went on to California, but later in this we'll get to another Tom Brundage, which is a nephew of the man whose diary I'm quoting from. In this wagon train that camped somewhere on Little Goose, between where we are right now and the town site of Sheridan, in July of 1864, there were 369 men, 36 women, 56 children, 636 oxen, 79 horses, 149 cattle, 149 wagons, with an estimated value of $130,000. Well, that's a lot of money in the 1860s. Apparently, they went on through to Virginia City with absolutely no interference at all. It wasn't mentioned that I could find in his diary. Now I'll go back to his brother George. And the Brundages, George, and his sons homesteaded land on both sides of Little Goose, just north of the town site of Sheridan, and Brundage Avenue, Brundage Lane, is named after this family. And we'll get to some of them later on in another ditch. One of the Brundage later homes is still visible east of I-90 and approximately south of where the old Skyland Theater used to be, back there in the grove of trees. It's hard to see, but you can see it, and I don't know the date of that building, but I've been told that that is the remnants or one of the later structures of either George Brundage or one of his two sons. And then the next appropriator on this burn clue ditch is E.A. Whitney. And he's Whitney of Whitney Benefits, and I won't try to give you a whole history of that because it's been well done. And any of you people who have not parked at the senior citizen parking lot adjacent to Whitney Commons should take the time, get out of your car, and walk over there and enjoy what's there. I won't go into it, but it's well worth your time. And then there was Edward Gillette, the filer on this burn clue ditch. And Edward Gillette shows up as a filer of early appropriations, and primarily he was doing land speculation work apparently for the CB&Q Railroad and for the city of Sheraton, possibly for himself, but I can't find exactly what it was. Then we get to the upper Little Goose filing. It's a little later in '81. And the upper Little Goose filing is not a ditch that's now in existence. It slid out back when I was a very small boy, about that high. I can remember to where riding behind the saddle with my father to where it was, nature destroyed it with a landslide. And it's now part of the Colorado colony by means of right of conveyance and change of diversion. But it's still a very good water right. The first appropriator was the estate of E. Cover, and no place can I find any reference to a Cover of that date by any name. So I just have to pass over. The next appropriator was J.O. Willits, my maternal grandfather, and I could spend hours talking about the history of these first landowners and appropriators. They had all done many, many things before coming here. I went into O.P. Hanna's, but all the rest of them, not all the rest of them, but most of them have done a lot of things. Like my grandfather, as a young boy, when he was 14 or a little older, had driven 4 head of oxen from Missouri to present area of present-day Sacramento for a Wells Fargo contractor. And then he worked out there 5 years, gone down the west coast on a ship and walked across the Isthmus of Panama before going back by ship to the east coast and going back to Illinois by the railroad. And I found at least 5 or 6 other of these early appropriators who had had similar treks like that and had walked one direction and one of them even both directions across the Isthmus of Panama prior to coming here. There were several Willits children. One of them died quite young. One of them became the mother of Iris Marquis, that we all knew passed away a couple of years ago. There was a son, Paul Willits, who was a lad of 12, drove one of the wagons. And when the Willits family got off the Union Pacific Railroad in Cheyenne, he drove one of the wagons, moving the family here to Bighorn, and he became company clerk for Company E of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. Now, Edward talked about changes in the water book and updates, not knowing who the patenters were, and Richard Parker, Dick Parker, whom many of us in this room remember well, had the land just across the road to the north of the Bighorn School, is listed as an appropriator, and that absolutely cannot be. I think that that water right was probably perfected by Abraham Zulik, who later became an appropriator in the last chance ditch, but I'm not sure of that. But he at least had that land at one time. That's as close as I can get to it. Then there was W.E. Jackson. Now the Jacksons were a very important part of the development of this community. Mr. Jackson, prior to coming here, had done several things, including working in a drugstore as a young man. And after he settled here in Bighorn, right over here to the west, right off in this direction, just off the town side of Bighorn, he used his knowledge that he'd learned in a drugstore to help a lot of people through sicknesses with the drugs that he kept on hand and administered to people quite very satisfactorily. Many people are indebted to him for it. He was a very hardworking, generous man. He gave the land for the Bighorn Institute College. He gave the land for the west side of Bighorn. He became the first supervisor of the Bighorn National Forest. And the office, the first office for the Bighorn National Forest, is still a building standing just off his property on the inside the town side of Bighorn on land that he gave to the town side of Bighorn. And that building's still standing over there. And I wonder why nobody has ever tried to put it in the National Register. It's been used as a home, and I drove by it not over 6 weeks ago, and the building's still there. That might be a project. He was a county commissioner, Jackson was county commissioner both in the territory and in the state. Part of that land is still in the family. That's where the Helveys live right now. The Helveys and the Jacksons are intermarried, so it's a relative situation. Then we come to the west side ditch. And the west side ditch is a very important part of the community of Bighorn. It's the ditch that's just to the west side of the road from Little Goose, up here where the Arnos used to live, clear through the town side of Bighorn, right at the foot of the hill as you start up past the Bighorn School. And it's in a straight line there for a half a mile, right through the town of Bighorn. And the second creamery in this area was built to use the water in that ditch for the cooling of milk and cream when it was the first commercial creamery. The Hurl were a dairy, but they weren't a commercial creamery because of their isolation up there by the foot of the mountain. And up till just a few years ago, and maybe it's still standing, it was part of the loading dock where wagons could pull up and set the milk cans out. And the house that I'm talking about is still there, and that's where the Taberna family lives right now. Okay, the first appropriator on that was J.H. Sackett. We've already talked about him. Then there was J.J. Wagner. And the Wagners and the Burgess family combination is a very important of the history of this family. Wagner married the widow Burgess. Mr. Burgess and Mr. Wagner had been partners in a gold mine in Nevada. And Mr. Burgess was killed in a gold mine, leaving a widow with 5 children. And Wagner married her, and they set out from Nevada, and I don't know whether they loaded on a Union Pacific Railroad and came east and got off, or whether they drove the whole way. But they were driving north on the Bozeman Trail, and Wagner had a boiler, 40 horsepower boiler and a steam to run a 40 horsepower sawmill. And he stopped at two locations south of here, one up on Crazy One and saw it, and he stopped on Piney Creek and saw it, and he wound up here. And the family story is that they were on the way to Virginia City. This was in 1881. The family story is that they got stuck in the mud here. And they decided they'd traveled long enough because he'd stopped and set up his sawmill a couple of times, and they just stayed. And he homesteaded the land that's just north of the town site here in Bighorn. This is where the Blue Barn Bread and Breakfast is now. And he homesteaded, and there were 5 Burgesses, and 2 of the Burgess sons homesteaded. One of them homesteaded land that was east, and that's the ranch the Garber agribusiness now owns, where the silos are over there. And my late brother Orr and I bought that ranch from one of the Burgess sons, Judge Harry Burgess, in August of 1939. He sold that sawmill that he had on wagons to Sackett and Skinner. And Sackett and Skinner set it up on the west bank of Little Goose, just right over here, just barely north of where we are right now, and I don't know how long they operated it there. That's another part of the Sackett Skinner history. Then there was Valentine Reese, who was a Civil War veteran. He must have been a very striking man, because I found it mentioned several times how striking a man he was. He stood an erect 6'2", and he was very proud of the fact that he had been with Sherman to the sea. Then we get to the Hurricane Ditch. And the Hurricane Ditch is on the west side of Little Goose, and it's north of where the Girdle Ditch ended, and down to about Brundage Lane. It may even some of it going north of Brundage Lane, I'm not sure. But here we get back to the Brundage family, and we get back to Thomas Brundage, who was named after his uncle that wrote the diary that I quoted from. But he's the son of George Brundage, and he and his brother came with the family in 1881. And I think I've given you enough history on the Brundages. And then there's the Bank of Commerce, was part of that. And I can't be sure of it, but I think that filing was probably Bank of Commerce and something to do with E.F. Perkins, who founded the Perkins Foundation, but I can't be positive of that. And then there was a John E. Early. And I can find nothing on John E. Early, but I can find a John C. Early, who was a land patenter in that location. And I think it's just a mistake in the water records of E and C. And he was a teamster of some renown and a house mover. And he lived in Sheridan and followed the trade of teamwork and house moving until he got to be older, and then he moved to Seattle. Now we come to the Red Hill Ditch. And the Red Hill Ditch is all south of here. And here again we come to another mistake in the water book. It lists Malcolm Moncrief as an original appropriator. He's the first person listed. And Malcolm Moncrief was not here at that time, but he ultimately owned a lot of the land that's in this appropriation. And I think Edward explained how that happened. But I'm going to give some history on Malcolm Moncrief, because it ties in with the Wallace and the William Moncrief. And these are Moncrief were original appropriators. But those three English men, Scottish and English men, all became naturalized citizens, and all were a very integral part of the community. And remember, Waugh bought the Hannah homestead, and then we sold it. And Waugh put together the Canyon Ranch. William Moncrief put together the ranch, the Gallatons and Bradford Britton, and Malcolm Moncrief put together what we know as the Polo Ranch. Malcolm Moncrief immediately became a citizen and served Company E as a private in the Spanish-American War. Here he was born an aristocrat, but he would not take a commission at all. But I think the thing that they did that probably did more for making the rest of the state and a lot of the United States cognizant of Little Goose Valley and Bighorn was their Boer War horse thing. I never realized it until just a few started working on this, but they actually gathered together, rough, broke, and sold to the British Army 22,500 head of horses, all from the Bradford Britton Ranch, and shipped them out here out of Sheridan on the CB&Q Railroad. I knew it was a big enterprise. Then the next appropriator on this Red Hill is Dan Wood, who was the son of Levi Wood from the east side ditch, and he had the land where Paddy Kelly now is, and he sold that in the 1930s to Edward S. Moore Jr. And some of you people probably remember that era. I do, I won't go into it now. Then there's the Davises as appropriators of that. And here again, the Davises are not here at the time of this appropriation. So that's a variation and a change in the water bowl. But I want to mention something about the Davises, because the old grandfather Davis was a Civil War veteran. He's the only veteran I ever knew that said he had a Civil War pension, and I knew his wife as a lad, and she had a Civil War widow's pension. And Bill Davis, I think, came to Buffalo and was the first jailer in Buffalo jail, first jailer, Buffalo, and they moved on over here. And ultimately that ranch belonged to son Bill Davis and Sophia Davis, who were an integral part of the community for many years. Probably a lot of you people know. Then there were the Spear Brothers, as part of the Red Hill. And they came here in September of 1883 as a group, and I quote from Willa Spear's diary. And this is part of Elsa's scrapbook of Bozeman Trail. They started one day's drive north of Custer Battlefield from a place called New Chicago. I can't find it on the map. I don't have any idea where it was. My diary, it was one day drive north of there, and they came across the Custer Battlefield on the way here. And it took them a week or 10 days because they came slow and saw out of country and were trading for a little salt. So I'll read what it says. We arrived here on September 83 as a group. And 24 people, 5 women, 3 blues, 2 horses, 8 cattle, and bought the land south of Bighorn and south of the Willits. They owned for some generations a spear ranch. That's owned now by a lot of people. There's a head gate there. It says that's what we're talking about. And the Spear family are very great on sharing Mr. Custis was also a gold miner, and he and a man by the name of Barrow dug for gold all over the Bighorn Mountains, and probably the one place that any of you that are acquainted in the mountains know about is the gold mine below Lake Geneva up East Fork of Big Goose. Any of you ever been there? It's quite a hole in the ground. The last time I was there was quite a little leftover machinery there, but that's getting to be some years ago. I'm sorry to go back to it, but I forgot the rest of that about Custis. Lewis was a lot holder in the first town site of Bighorn, and he also had a livery barn here in Bighorn, and he owned and operated for a short time a stage route from, I think it was Buffalo to Old, prior to the time of the railroad. I know it was from Bighorn at least to Old. That's all I know about that stage route. Here again, my notes say that he's buried in Bighorn. Most of these appropriators were buried in Bighorn. Then we get to Abraham Zulig, who was born in Switzerland and was a cobbler, and he augmented his income. He homesteaded over on Cruise Creek, and Zulig, the last of the Zulig land just changed hands a couple of years ago. I think that Abraham Zulig was probably an original appropriator in the upper Little Goose ditch, but I can't be sure of it. But his oldest son, Herbert Zulig, became a shared businessman and ran an insurance and real estate business in Sheridan for many, many years. Probably some of you people knew him. And then Conrad Zulig, the second son, was a member of Troop E, the Rough Riders, and Archie Zulig, who was a neighbor of mine and all of us in the community for many, many years. You probably know him as the supreme collector of Indian artifacts. And I don't know where his great collection of Indian artifacts are. Now we get to the Colorado Ditch, which is the largest ditch. And as Edward said, it was appropriated for 6,320 acres. And here we get to Lem Martin. And Lem Martin was really the person who actually did the digging and development of the ditches and water rights, a lot of them. The Colorado Ditch was filed on by a group of investors from northern Colorado, who were Captain C.M. Tyler, J.W. Denio, John Barr, Thomas Williams. And Lem Martin, who was called, his name was Lemel Martin, but everybody called him Lem. As a young man, he'd worked his way west through Kansas to Cripple Creek, Colorado, and then to Boulder, Colorado, and that's where he met Captain Tyler, who respected him and hired him to come here and develop the company's land. And that company was called the Colorado Development Company, the Colorado Ditch Company, and then it became the Home Ranch Corporation. And at one time it was divided into at least 20 some ranches, and in total there was about 10,000 acres, although the water right only covered 6,000 some. And I suppose a lot of you remember the old home ranches. The majority of it now is subdivisions, but there's still some open land in it. And I won't describe where the home ranches are, or where that land is, except that it's primarily the land west of the highway into Sheridan that you take at the junction and connects with Bighorn Avenue is the land west of there and under the Colorado ditch. So it is quite a block of land. This ditch company fitted Martin out and wagons and everything. When I finish, Judy and Edward will show you pictures, and a picture of Lemuel Martin's outfit when he came through Cheyenne from Boulder, Colorado, was a part of this month's news, Historical Society newsletter. Now, no discussion on water rights in the Little Goose Valley would be complete without Jack Dow. Jack Dow was not an original appropriator, but he was an original engineer. And he had graduated from the University of Wisconsin, and he had practiced his trade in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and he was county surveyor of Lamar County, Colorado, before he came here. He got married in Colorado, and just a note in one of the things I read that sets him a little different, says that he came to the Bighorn area driving 3 horses abreast, which wasn't common, but I just passed that along. He's credited and was very proud. One of his proudest accomplishments was he was the engineer on the Tunnel Hill ditch. And I can remember when Tunnel Hill ditch was a tunnel. And I imagine some of you people can. All in the 1950s the tunnel caved in, but it irrigates Lower Prairie Dog, it irrigates McCormick Creek, Magpie Creek, and a lot from some of Cruz Creek. He was the engineer on the Peralta ditch. He was engineer on the Colorado ditch. He platted the town sites of Bighorn and the town site of Sheridan. He was Sheridan County Surveyor in 1888. He was a county commissioner in 1889 and 1892. And although he was not an original appropriator, the Dow family are the only family that have a basic agricultural operation that is still in the family name. Some other families have pieces and bits of original appropriation, but like I said, he wasn't appropriator, but the land's still in the family. And with that, I'll close and turn it over to pictures on reservoir development, and Edward helped us along with the diversions out of Cross Creek, which became the Peralta Ditch.
pictures from the, Bensel, not Bensel, Dean, Basil Dean. And I saw those when I was at the Park Reservoir regulating water. She had them up there. A nice big thick folder of photographs. And these are Bowman's photographs, so there's another set around someplace. Anybody knows Basil Dean, get a hold of Judy and tell her where they are. Document them. That's all I have on that much.
I have a comment on that. Dick Bodine and I were up at the reservoir not too long ago, and we were going way down. And one of the old scrapers, Dick has diagrams of it, the Russell scrapers out there, right at the edge of the water, rusted pretty good, and a lot of hubs, wooden wagon wheels and some steel wheels. You can see a lot of it laying there, and it was drained down some more, but there is one scraper there. Dick claims it's a Russell scraper.
No. That's the way a lot of contractors did, when something broke down, they buried the whole stuff, they never see it again. Every reservoir's got cables showing up in the wheels. That's why I wanna thank you people for